Okay, in the third part of the content today on the spaces of consumption, I want to talk a little bit about the consumption spaces in everyday life, and also a little bit about kind of notions of fake fantasy and control. That's kind of part of the critical theory about these spaces. So certainly the flaner is no longer just a male kind of strolling outdoors. It's kind of democratized in that sense, where a multiplicity of genders, genders, sexualities, classes, and races take part in this kind of stuff. But as actual kind of ethnographic research shows about what is kind of legitimate and illegitimate in these kind of new commercialised public spaces, and the work of Rob White in the 90s in Australia was particularly interesting around this. That work showed that really only some people can legitimately just hang out and do whatever they want. Particularly groups of young working class males were often moved on, tended to have then confrontational relationships with police, and you can see stuff like this still play out around things like Charlestown Square in Newcastle. There's often things like that going on there as well. So this relates somewhat to the kind of privatisation of public space. As malls become the dominant places where people go to hang out, if you don't have money to kind of hang out legitimately, it often means that you moved on, and then you'll experience forms of status frustration and then tend to have more likely confrontational relations with authority figures. Critics of the rise of the mall and shopping centres as the kind of new town halls and new cathedrals and the like argue that it's kind of that shiny facade of consumer culture. It hides the exploitative ways that most products are made and the inequalities around who benefits from this. It hides the immense waste that's part of those systems, and it hides the detrimental environmental effects. So the mall kind of is in a way a smokescreen for all the problems of consumer culture from this point of view. And we'll look into that in some detail when we look at when I do the lecture on waste in particular. A key way of thinking about the rise of the mall, and this relates somewhat to the notions of McDonaldization, which Richard draws on this idea of the nonplace, is this kind of notion that these consumer cathedrals are fairly homogenous all around the world. They're very, very similar in most ways. Now, that does not say they're exactly the same. Some of them will have like roller coasters in them. Some will have, high-end food. Some will have movie theatres or whatever. But the most part, they tend to have similar architectures, similar use of space and that kind of thing. For the French anthropologist Marc Aug, he argues that these consumer places, such as transit zones, airports, hotels, fast food places, most movie theatres and malls, and even things like petrol stations on highways and supermarkets, are what he described as non-places. So where places have relational, historical, and are relational, are historical and concerned with identity. Aug theorises the non-place as basically being places with the absence of those things. They're what he calls dead or inert spaces that are filled with everyday moments of people who do not live or dwell there. So importantly here, he's arguing essentially that these places are kind of placeless. They're very similar all around the world. They don't invoke kind of intense emotions. They basically, or certainly forms of self-expression or creativity, they tend to be designed to make people behave in very conformative ways. They create an atmosphere of what Aug calls the perpetual present, where you're constantly constantly moving from one place to the next, and particularly where time and place is compressed. You won't see a lot of clocks in places like supermarkets, casinos, and shopping malls. So these things are basically the placelessness idea is they're the same regardless of where you are, and they're largely ahistorical. They're all kind of encourage you to kind of think and feel is in the kind of perpetual here and now. Frequently in these places, people are largely individualised from each other. There's often not a lot of recognition going on between people here as they kind of, act like a flaneur, move around the place and just concentrate on looking at things, but also looking at other people, but other people as if they're things, not so much in some kind of close relationship or whatever. So there's a feeling at home in these places because they become increasingly familiar, but they're anonymous non-places. And there's a paradox going on here that Org argues kind of produces an ambivalent existence. So in this reading of malls, they're a cultural vacuum. They suck in everything around it, but denude it of creativity, context, authenticity, art, meaning. They produce nothing but commodity fetishism. So you can see here this is a particularly critical analysis of what's going on in these places. There's not a lot of room in this analysis for everyday making do and forms of reappropriation that the likes of the subcultural theorists or Michel de Certeau argue that's possible within these consumer realms. So moving on from that overtly critical way of thinking about it, we can think of some other, I suppose, ways of thinking about these places where there's a little bit more autonomy going on. If not complete autonomy, you can't go to these places and do whatever you want, but there are opportunities to have some more autonomy, to have some more self-expression. So Benjamin talks about this as kind of collective dreaming, that people go to these places with similar intents, sometimes to be around similar people, but they still tend to act like flaneurs, kind of just, observing what's going on rather than connecting with each other. But from other perspectives, malls can be seen as much more places of contemplation. So here we can move back to those kind of semiotic ways of that encoding and decoding, where mall spaces are particularly, specifically encoded to try and get us to behave in certain ways, but it's then up to us to kind of decode what's going on. And we can decode what's going on there in a variety of ways. Now, whether that's just, going there very pragmatically just to get the groceries and leaving, or, going only to certain shops, or trying to consume ethically, although that's very difficult in shopping malls in particular. That's aspects of it. But there's also kind of more experiential ways of kind of bricolaging the mall space, whether that's going there completely hang out, going there to try and, meet boys or girls and not actually doing any consumption, going to the car parks and skating, going and, sitting in one of the back little gardens and drinking with your friends or whatever. These are kind of seen as particularly youthful ways of appropriating these public spaces that, as I said, come into confrontation with authority sometimes, but also are ways for people to, move beyond that kind of overt structuring of social space. So we can see these malls are certainly structured by power, where rules and laws are present, and they're often very much applied by increasing presence of security guards in these places. And the architecture of the space is meant to kind of create pretty much a commodity kind of fetishized fantasy world away from the real world. But they can also be sites of subversion, even if those forms of subversion are quite small. So certainly young people and unemployed use these places in their own ways, and this has become a new kind of offence called loitering. And John Fiske writes about the pleasures of stealing and shoplifting and things like that in particular as a way of rebelling against the dominant of these places. Another rise of way of consuming is this notion of ironic consumption. And again, this kind of relates to that savvy way of making do, where that even though public space may be dominated by these kind of overtly consumeristic rules and regulations and architecture, people can kind of know about that stuff and still participate it in not so much as a cultural dupe way, even though the end result might be buying stuff, but you may have some kind of individual freedom and creativity and attitude and effect if you kind of know that and participate in this stuff ironically. And you can particularly do that with groups of like-minded people. So to sum up, in terms of the spaces of consumption, again, I've been trying to draw upon a kind of dichotomy here of how to think about this stuff, the savvy and the suckers. Certainly there's public spaces are set up in particular ways that that resonate a lot with notions of McDonaldization, the Frankfurt School stuff about pseudo-individualization, non-places, even Goffman's idea of total institutions can help us think about some of the things that are going on in the architecture of these public spaces. But as individual consumers or groups of consumers, we can play with these contradictions and we can appropriate these spaces in our own ways. So again, I'm trying to play off here the kind of relationship between social identity and self-identity, and the kind of different conceptions of power, what's going on in these spaces that are both the institutionalized way that these places are encoded, and then the kind of individualized ways that we can decode these spaces, I think are key ways to think about what goes on in these places. Okay, thanks.